Okay, it is officially time for me to talk about another Murakami book. Today I will be talking about Colorless Tskuru Tazaki and His Years of Pilgrimage by Haruki Murakami, of course, translated by Philip Gabriel. I believe this one is Philip Gabriel. Let me double check that. First page. Yep, Philip Gabriel. So a little confession behind the scenes, but it's actually really hard. The hardest books for me to discuss are the ones that kind of hit emotionally, because I tend to try to do these recordings as soon as I finish the book, because that's when the thoughts are sort of freshest before life gets in the way and I lose grasp on my memory of things. But it's also when the emotions are really fresh, and sometimes I really just don't want to do a video for certain books or recording, because I just want to be left alone with those emotions, and I don't really want to share or talk about them. I just want to hold them and reflect on them. But in this case, I'll just suck it up and talk about it anyway, because the reason I chose this book, as I mentioned last time, there is a particular story in here that it's not a collection of short stories. It's just a story within the story where somebody is recounting a story that their father told them about a Japanese inn, and the way the inn is described always stuck with me. And whenever I read a story or play something or see something that has a Japanese inn as a theme or location, it always pops into my mind. The last time it was Banana Yoshimoto's Kitchen, and it just finally triggered my desire to reread this book because it's been a long time. The first time I read it, I was surprised. I kind of put off reading it because at the time it was Murakami's most recent release, and reviews were kind of pretty all over the place for it, and understandably coming off of 1Q84. But when I did read it, I was really surprised at how much I enjoyed it at the time. And ever since, it's nowhere near my top tier Murakami's, but I've always felt like it's a bit underappreciated. But I kind of also understand why, in a way, because it does revisit so many similar themes from like Sputnik Sweetheart and throughout Murakami's career. But I think it's a lot more opaque in terms of how it talks about them. So, to give a brief plot summary, you have Tskuru Tazaki, who, when he was in high school, had a group of 5 friends, or rather, including him, they were a group of 5, and 4 of his friends had colors in their last name, which is pretty common in Japan. You had Ao, Aki, Shiro, and Kuro. So Ao is blue, Aki is red, Shiro is white, and Kuro is black. These weren't their exact names. It was like Akikawa or something like that. But that was always what it got shortened to. But of course, his name didn't have a color associated with it, hence the title Colorless Tskuru Tazaki. And he's always felt like he didn't quite belong, or he felt like a bit of the odd man out in the group, even though the group was described as being perfectly harmonious. And yet, despite that, one day, let me back up a minute. So they're in high school, they're this group of 5, and they're getting along really well, and everything's really great. And then they live in Nagoya. He decides that he wants to go to Tokyo to go to a engineering school to learn how to build train stations. So that's what he does. And even though the rest of the group stays in Nagoya, he goes to Tokyo. And for the first 2 years or so, everything is okay. He goes back regularly to visit with them every time he has a break. What ends up happening is they end up one day out of the blue kicking him out of their group. And they give him no definition, and no reasoning, no justification, and it's such an abrupt surprise to him that he becomes actually not suicidal, but really, really depressed about it to the point that he could potentially die at any moment and he wouldn't even care. So that happens, and it's not about this. He slowly recovers, but the book actually takes place 16 years later. He's about 36, and he is meeting with a girl named Sara, who he really, really likes, and he's having problems interacting with her, and he wants to get really serious with her, but before she wants to commit to anything deeper, she basically requires that he go back and meet his old friends and figure out why he was forced out of this group and solve that past mystery in his life. So, would I recommend this book, and to who would I recommend it to? Obviously, I mean, it's Murakami. I would have a hard time finding one of his books that I wouldn't recommend, even though they do exist. But as to who I would recommend it to, again, not the best place to start with Murakami, not the worst place to start with Murakami, but in terms of like, okay, let's say you've read Kafka on the Shore, Wind Up Bird Chronicle, Norwegian Wood, Sputnik Sweetheart. After you've read those, kind of the bigger ones, then I would say definitely is when it's time to give Colorless a shot, if you're still interested in Murakami's work and the sort of repetition of his themes doesn't bother you or hasn't bothered you yet. Because like I said, it's not the most original of his works, but it definitely has that more grounded take where it doesn't lean as heavily into the magical realism aspects as Sputnik Sweetheart does, and it's not completely absent magical realism, but it's way more realistic than something like Kafka on the Shore or Wind Up Bird Chronicle. So if you like, and I guess that would be another person that I would recommend it to, is somebody who likes Murakami's more grounded work. Just be aware that it's not 100% grounded, but it's like 90% there. So getting into the pros and cons of the book with minor spoilers, the pros are, as ever, everything about Murakami's writing that I personally enjoy, that anybody can enjoy, is on display here. With the con, that it's not him at his peak with his prose. He's doing third person, which that's going to be a pro for some people and a con for others. I don't think his third person work has the same emotional resonance as his first person work, but that could just be my personal preference for first person narrative and the way that I think first person narrative plays with subjectivity, which is really important to a lot of his work, and I think it's kind of important to this work too, but I'll get more into that in the themes. In terms of cons, it's kind of hard to talk about cons, not because I think that it's the perfect book, but because it's kind of so tightly structured that outside of the final 10 pages that I don't, aside from like the last 2 pages, maybe 2 or 3 pages, the last 10 to 20 pages don't really feel like they add much to the story. And if anything, they kind of take away from some of the weight that went on in the earlier scenes. So that is kind of definitely a con, but otherwise, I mean, it's difficult to sort of criticize the book insofar as I don't think it has like quite the character depth or something of any of Murakami's larger books, but at the same time I don't think it's really trying for that. I think I remember reading that it was originally planned as a short story that kind of ballooned into a short novel, and I can see that. I think in terms of what it set out to do, it accomplished it pretty well, and it's just difficult for me to think of a con that I would really call is a failing of the book and not something that I would have preferred or liked to have seen or something like that, or I feel really damages the book in some way, even down to the ending, which I have seen some people online, much like the ending of Norwegian Wood, sort of criticize it for being as open-ended as it is, but and I'll get into this more in the themes, but I feel like it's not necessarily a problem because the book isn't about that on the surface. So in that sense, it's not that I think that there are any cons. It's not that I think that it's a flawless book, rather. It's just that I think it's kind of a short book and it accomplishes what it sets out to do, kind of like with Kitchen. It's not the easiest thing for me to criticize these shorter works because it is what it is, and for what it is, I think it's fantastic. So don't take this, again, as when I'm struggling to come up with a con, don't take it as this is a flawless book, or like this is one of the best works ever, or even like this is the best Murakami book. That's not the case. It's just that sometimes you have these smaller books or movies or whatnot where they set out with a goal and they accomplish this goal. And sometimes by the nature of being bigger but messier, things can resonate more with people, which is why like my personal favorite books just in general are always bigger, messier books with kind of more pros and more cons. So the absence of cons doesn't necessarily mean it's a perfect book, just means that it accomplished, I think, what it set out to accomplish. So now that I'm done talking in circles, I'm going to go ahead and just move into themes really quickly, which I guess before I go full on to themes and full on spoilers, another pro, I think, is, again, the themes are really, really on the nose. And I guess this could also be taken as a con. That's another thing I should say, is since I did just finish this book, it did hit me emotionally, as Murakami's works always do. I am absolutely biased. So if I was to think about this for a few days, I'd most likely be able to come up with several cons. But the book, its themes are very clear, very conveyed very clearly, and the visuals are very on the nose, at least by the standards of Murakami. It's certainly a far cry from something like R.F. Kuang, where it feels like you're being beaten over the fucking head with the themes. But in terms of a Murakami book, you definitely will get the picture. And at one point towards the end, he even presents a hypothesis for what happens, which could have just as easily had been left completely ambiguous, and I don't think the story would have changed much. But that's certainly something to keep in mind. It could be a pro or a con, depending on you. In terms of Murakami's books, it's one of the easiest ones to understand, in my opinion. So now I will definitely move into themes. So give me 1 second here to take a drink. Okay, themes and spoilers. Obviously the biggest theme of the book is how life takes you in separate directions and how you sort of cope with the way in which things change. So I mentioned it being really obvious a few seconds ago, and with like sort of the metaphors, and it comes down to the colors and the train station. And for those of you like me, I used to, when I lived in the United States, live somewhere where there were no trains, and I didn't realize that railway maps are all colored. So the way that people's are colored in the book is definitely a clear metaphor for rail lines, which if you look up a rail map, you will see that the lines are all colored, and it's how they sort of come together at a station, which Tskuru Tazaki is not a color himself, but he's interested in building stations. So it's how all of his friends and his group converged, and then once he was kicked out of the group, how it all fell apart, but how people's lives moved on regardless. And that's just the sort of major theme, is that idea of life moving forward, and the idea that life, the past isn't something that you can ignore, that it will come back and exert its influence, which, now that I think about it, is actually one thing that really separates it from Sputnik Sweetheart, because Sputnik Sweetheart also has the visual metaphor I've talked about of satellites coming together and then parting, and these satellites being in different orbit. So in the sense that Murakami's themes repeat themselves, you have the sort of satellites coming together and parting being a metaphor for our lives and how they merge and part. And then you have in Colorless rail stations and rail maps and that also being a metaphor for how lives converge in part. But Sputnik Sweetheart sort of focused on the loneliness aspect of it, but Colorless also has this angle, as I've said, and it's fitting, really, being a later work from the author, of, like I said, the past and how the past comes back to you, to the point where I know that Murakami is a huge fan of The Great Gatsby. He mentions it multiple times in all his books. He's even translated it into Japanese. And so at the end of chapter 16, you have the line, the beating of her heart kept time with the slap of the little boat against the pier. And I can't help but wonder if this is a reference to the finale, the final lines of Gatsby. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne ceaselessly into the past. One of the major interpretations being which you cannot escape the past. That being kind of the thing that Gatsby was all about, was Gatsby trying to sort of recapture the past, being new money and all that, and how you can't quite escape who you were. And here too, you have a character who can't escape, even though he had this massive depression in his life. He never really got over it, because his way of coping with the problem was to turn away from it and to try not to think about it. And this in turn affected his ability to engage with people later on. And it's why he couldn't really have girlfriends that lasted very long. But now that he has met with Eri Sara, and can't connect with her, or rather wants to connect with her, but when she connects with him, it's described as she doesn't feel like he's giving anything in return. And my interpretation of this is that it stems from, because the ending talks about how relationships are give and take. And throughout the whole book, he's worried that being colorless, he's this sort of empty vessel. And when it comes to him having nothing to give, it's because he's not sort of living his life fully in the moment, because there's this big part of him that he is refusing to accept, refusing to confront, and refusing to sort of deal with. And so this is why it becomes incumbent upon him to go back into the past and figure it out and really face it, so that when he does approach Eri is Kuro's name, but anyway, so that when he does approach Sara again, he can do so with the and be capable of giving himself to her completely. So that's a big theme, and I'll continue into that more. But I think one of the other sort of themes that gets woven into the book, and that you really see at the end, well, okay, he goes through this journey, he meets with Akka, he meets with Ao, and you see how much they change, and then he discovers that Shiro is dead, that she was murdered, and he also discovers that she blamed him for her rape. And I know rape is a very difficult topic for some people, so I've seen some criticism about the book for the way that it handles that. I'm not a woman, I've never known anybody who experienced rape, so I'm not really going to comment on whether I think it was handled well or not well, because I don't know that. But I think in terms of what it does for the story, it's interesting, because she blames Tskuru for the rape, which it's stated did definitely happen, but it's also stated that he obviously didn't do it and isn't responsible for it. But to a God, I just totally blanked on where I was going with this. But insofar as why she chose Tskuru to blame for it, Tskuru makes a hypothesis at the end. And and I've seen this also in some of Murakami's work, where a character will make a hypothesis, and usually you should take that hypothesis at face value, which I think is okay for the most part. But I don't think it always necessarily needs to be something that you should take as the God-given truth, because when he does finally meet with Eddie, one of the things that he realizes, and this is kind of another theme of the book, I think, although it doesn't really emerge until later, is the fact that in his mind, he kind of pictures everything in the past as being perfect. And he says, I always thought of myself as the victim, but I never realized how things I've done may have been hurting other people. And throughout the book, it describes a darkness inside him. And a lot of Murakami's books deal with this characters who have this quote-unquote darkness inside them, or darker aspects to their personality. And the sort of idea, again, in terms of recurring themes throughout his work, is that humans have baser tendencies, baser impulses, and that you can't sort of deny that those impulses exist, because if you do, then oftentimes they end up bursting out or expressing themselves in his works, often in metaphorical ways, but they lead to these sort of bursts of violence or bursts of anger or whatnot. But that also, by not acknowledging that side, that everybody in the group was so focused on the good times that they also were kind of ignorant to the amount of ways that they could subtly be harming each other, or possibly harming other people with their actions, even just by virtue of the fact that they viewed somebody with certain expectations could have placed on them a burden that they weren't necessarily able to handle. And it's not, I think, that Murakami is saying that this is bad and that you shouldn't be doing this or whatnot, just that this is an aspect of human relationships that you need to be aware of, at the very least, that as much as there is this sort of good side and this joy and pleasure to being around people, there can be these unintended consequences, these sort of darker aspects, that words carry weight and messages that are picked up on by other people in ways that maybe we didn't necessarily intend. And I kind of, when Tskuru says with his meeting with during his meeting with Eddie that maybe I did kill her, it's sort of an expression of the fact that he did like her. This is sort of repeated multiple times, both in the fact that when he had these sexual dreams, it was always Shiro that he was the one who ejaculated into, but he admits it at the end that he liked her. And it's also said that she's very sensitive. So even without the part at the end where he hypothesizes that the reason that Shiro broke up the group was because she knew that it had to end someday, and that she wouldn't be able to handle that, and she was already sensing the cracks forming, so rather than wait for it to break apart, she wasn't able to handle that stress, that pressure, and she sort of exploded it on her own impetus. And that certainly fits with everything, and it's not that I think that's bad. I just think that even without that particular explanation being spelled out for you, there's enough there in the conversation between Eddie and Tskuru where he says, maybe I did kill her through these dark thoughts that I have, which these dark thoughts are really just the fact that he lusted after her, which, again, isn't necessarily a dark thought. It's just an aspect of, humanity, that sort of desire, almost overwhelming to be with somebody. But Eddie was also interested in him. So, but in a sense, even if you don't make those behaviors known to the other person, another person, particularly a sensitive person, as Shiro is described as being, can pick up on those changes in behaviors, and that will affect them and how they feel around you. And that's what I mean by this sort of aspect, this quote-unquote dark side, where your sort of feelings can be picked up on by other people, even if you don't necessarily mean to express them that way, and they can place burdens on other people, even if you don't necessarily mean for them to do so. And Eddie likewise mentions that she likes Tskuru, which Shiro also knew and picked up on. So Shiro being liked by Tskuru, who her friend is the one who likes, and Shiro herself having no feelings for Tskuru, creates this sort of complicated situation for Shiro, who never asked for this. And it's not a case where I think that anybody is really wrong. I mean, they're feelings at the end of the day. Like, liking somebody isn't wrong. And it's obviously said that Tskuru never acted with any impropriety towards Shiro, just like Eri never did acted with any impropriety towards him. So it's just kind of like the tragedy of the sort of unspoken dynamics and the pressures that can create on somebody, because again, this is the third time I've said this, but I can finally finish this thought. Tskuru says, maybe I did in my own way kill her, and Eri also says, maybe I did in my own way kill her too. And it's just this idea of how these sort of various thoughts come together to create pressures on someone that lead them to act in ways that they might not, or to create burdens on them. And like I said, I do not for the life of me believe that Tskuru or Kuro are bad people for feeling that the way that they did, nor do I think that Aka is bad, nor do I think that Aoi is bad, nor do I think that Shiro is awful, even if, let's take Tsukuru's hypothesis at face value, both of them, including his perceived potential relationship with Eri, which, if you haven't read the book, Eri Kuro, his idea is that maybe they would have gotten together, he would have accepted her feelings had she confessed them to him, and they would have been happy for a while, but that life probably still would have pulled them in different directions, and while they might not have ended up together, they probably would have stayed good friends. So in that sense, like, Shiro's actions definitely bombed that completely and demolished their friendship, but Shiro herself is just, she was in a really, really difficult place emotionally and not equipped to handle it. And I personally find it difficult to blame her for that. But I think that reading it again sort of as an adult and appreciating the dynamic that Murakami has constructed here, and I think that there's an amount of empathy towards all the characters and their situations that allows it to be complex in a way that I really appreciate, where I think you can sort of blame or not blame or interpret the situation differently, that I really love about this book and a lot of Murakami's work. The characters, a lot of Murakami's characters get kind of criticized for not necessarily being deep, but in a way I think that's not necessarily true, because while the characters in Colorless aren't exactly deep, the situations that arise out of the very realistic way that Murakami has captured the portrayals of people does a really accurate job of capturing the difficulties and challenges of group dynamics. And to sort of bring this back to the what I said, the larger visual metaphor of train stations, the thing that I really appreciate so much about this book, in compared to something like a high school drama or a coming of age story or any of the other sort of YA stories that you see so much today, whether it's in like any kind of anime, any kind of manga, but a lot of times in Western literature too, like coming of age fiction is so popular. But Colorless really approaches it from the macro scale of an entire life, where the incident that occurred at the high school and then the college with Tskuru suddenly getting banished from the book, or from his group of friends, could have been a novel unto itself. And then he finds out that Shiro convicted him and he was falsely accused and blah, blah, blah. And that could have been it. And it could have been just this little snapshot of life. And that would have been like, okay. I think a lot of people would have enjoyed that. And it's not that I'm saying that this type of story is bad. It's just that what I think that Colorless really brings to the table is that you get the macro view, where rather than just this event that lasted like 1 to 2 years, you get to see, and what the story is really about is how that incident affected their lives, but how even in spite of that tragedy, all of them went on to have lives that they all found their own kind of happiness, even if it's not necessarily like super happiness. Like Aka is a homosexual who is unable to express that, and certainly what he does is on the surface not great, but he also subtly donates to a church, and like Eddie says, he acts a lot worse than he is. But really there's this other theme where I think Sputnik itself is a good example, where Sputnik is a really good look at this sort of event that happens, whereas Colorless is a look at how people cope with that event 16 years down the road. And that, I think, is just really what makes the book interesting, because you can't live forever in the past, but at the same time, if you don't accept the past, then it will never leave you. It is a part of you, and if you can't accept that, then you're fundamentally rejecting a part of yourself. And that's just what I think makes the book such an interesting book. And even though it does, and this is to talk about Murakami a little bit more broadly as an author, earlier I mentioned it covering a lot of the same themes, and a lot of his books do cover the same themes, but in such different ways, or from a different perspective. So, like, I see a lot of Sputnik Sweetheart in Colorless Tskuru Tazaki, and you will even see some phrases repeated from Sputnik Sweetheart. But whether it's that sort of aspect of the past, or the macro look at how these events affect you throughout time, it's always the same themes, but remixed and explored in a different light. And I think that's why he's one of my favorite authors, is, I just really enjoy seeing that, and I really enjoy thinking about it in my own life. So I hope that you have enjoyed listening to me ramble about this book that I am still thinking on substantially, despite having read it multiple times. And next up is going to be Yoko Ogawa's Mina's Matchbox. So look forward to it.